How's that? Better. All right, I'll project so it will work out.
You can drop the microphones to the handheld.
Yeah, great. All right. That was awesome to hear from Sam first, talking about more fundamental properties. And now I'm going to dive in maybe too much detail for you into this non-equilibrium chemistry that he alluded to. My title is stolen from Jackie's proposal title, Explaining the Diversity of Cold Worlds. And then I've added the caption, which is my focus amongst this large team's work of non-equilibrium chemistry in late T and Y dwarfs. And before I proceed, I thought I would kind of introduce this program and what its goals were, because there's a few more talks coming up that are subsets of it, and I'm the first one, so I'll take the time to kind of explain it. So the goal was to explain this diversity of cold worlds in the sense that we have this nice Spitzer color magnitude diagram where there are parallaxes for all of these, so we know distances and we can put them on here. So the light gray points are all of the sample, and then the GO2124 went after 12 of these objects that are highlighted with the different colors and symbols. And we chose to use the G395H because it hones in on that non-equilibrium chemistry, but at a higher resolution than what Sam was presenting before. And yes, so that's objects that span these late T and Y dwarfs that Jackie introduced for us. So temperatures of 800 Kelvin to about 350. And then we also have 0855 hanging out down here by itself at a cooler 275 Kelvin. Looking at that region, and the GO2124, in order to kind of capture this diversity, is looking at 4 objects that are median. So those are highlighted in red. They kind of fall along the average behavior of all of these objects, and then 4 objects that are overluminous. Some of those were already known to be binaries, and then other ones we weren't quite sure, but we would have thought maybe they're also binaries, and you'll see some thoughts on that later. And then below the median, we have some objects that are underluminous for their Spitzer color. And as it turns out, when we collected our spectra, they are not just underluminous and overluminous for their Spitzer color in the 4.5, they also are in the bolometric sense as well, although not to the same extent. Yeah, so this is a program that Jackie proposed and then had a big team of people. Many of you are here in the audience. And then lots of the people doing some of the actual work lately are some folks who weren't on the original proposal, including myself. And then I've also have people who I talk to about modeling that aren't necessarily official parts of the team. So thank you to all of you. Yeah, so those of you with keen eyes will have noticed that the original talk was supposed to be by Ben Birmingham doing retrievals about this sample. But you're actually hearing from me doing a forward model analysis. So I thought I would say my 2 cents about these 2 techniques. I think they're both super useful, and that ultimately it's going to be bringing these together that's going to help us really understand what's happening. And I'm excited. Harshal's talk later, I think, is a great example of the synergy between these 2 approaches. But briefly, retrievals are a little more data-driven. We take the spectrum, and then we try to back out what parameterized temperature pressure profile and what abundances of major absorbers best explain the spectrum that we see. But we don't necessarily make assumptions about it being in radiative convective equilibrium or having specific chemistry going on or anything. And then on the other side, we have forward models where we make assumptions about the physics that we think is going on in these objects, and we try to predict what they'll look like as we vary some fundamental parameters, their effective temperature, their surface gravity, what they're composed of. And then these are very useful for making boundary conditions for those evolutionary models that Sam was talking about. And then we can use them to predict things for proposals, and what I'm doing here, compare them to observations. So ultimately, I think these come together, and we want our retrievals and our forward models to be able to give us the same answer. And when they disagree, that's a place for us to learn more. Yeah. So as I said, I'll be doing more forward model analysis. So that means I'm using some grids that I made and that Shognik Mukherjee made with 2 different codes. And I'm choosing to use 2 different grids because I want to capture some of the uncertainties in these codes and the assumptions we make, and then also because we've chosen to treat our chemistry slightly differently, which I will explain throughout the talk. Yeah, so this is a set of grids that I published last year, but then I've had to expand them a little to be more applicable to the data because there's a lot going on in the data and we're always needing to improve our models to match them. So without further ado, let's get into the weeds of how we talk about chemistry or how we model chemistry in these objects. So some of you, this will be old news. You can tune out and tune back in a few slides, but some of you, I think this will hopefully make things a lot clearer. When we calculate the ground state thermochemical equilibrium for cold brown dwarfs, we would expect there to be more methane because at cold temperatures, methane is the preferred carbon reservoir. And at hot temperatures, CO is the preferred carbon reservoir. And so if you have a brown dwarf, it's colder near the surface and hotter at depth. And so up in your photosphere, you think you should see methane. But what we have happening in these brown dwarfs is they are vigorously convective. And so you can end up mixing CO from deep in your atmosphere up into your photosphere more quickly than your chemical reaction networks can switch it back to methane. So here's my cartoon illustration of this that I'm going to take the time to walk through because it's very relevant for our main results that I'm going to show you. So I'm showing on the far side, there's the time scales, relevant time scales on the bottom, and then the depth you are in your atmosphere. And then I'll fill out these other plots as we go. But we have our mixing time scale in the solid line and our CO to methane trade-off time scale in the dashed line. And when we talk about using this quench approximation to treat that vertical mixing, we're looking for the point where these 2 timescales cross, and that's our quench point. So below this, our chemistry acts faster than our mixing, and we think things should be in chemical equilibrium. Above this point, our mixing acts faster than our chemistry, and we think the abundances will be fixed at the values they have at that quench point. So now this second plot's showing volume mixing ratio on the bottom and depth again. And that shows up in our spectra as a certain amount of methane absorption and a certain amount of CO absorption. So if we instead crank up the strength of that mixing time scale, we say the mixing is stronger, so the time scale is shorter, then we hit that quench point deeper in our atmosphere and we end up with more CO and less methane, and our spectra looks quite different. So this is this quench approximation. Next time you hear someone say that, this is what they're talking about. And I will be saying it later on. So here's our sample, and this is what we're trying to explain this diversity, and we really thought going into it that that was going to be part of the story. And so here's our spectra. Without further ado, I'm showing them it's the same color coding. So orange is overluminous, red is average, blue is underluminous. And they're arranged in our best estimate of what the temperature order is. So it's hottest going down and then continuing down, ending up with 0855 at the bottom here. And so here's the CO2 and the CO that we think is tracing that, or I think we're quite confident now is tracing that mixing. And what you will notice if you squint at this for a long time, like me and many others have been doing, is that there's not a nice clean sequence where the CO is just increasing with temperature. We have like 0503, this weirdo, where there's a really big CO2 feature here, and this is like one of our coldest objects. So that's pretty puzzling to us when we first look at it. It's not necessarily what we expected, but it's like similar to what Sam's finding. And actually, when you go back and look at the modeling, it's not quite so shocking. So this is kind of the first big takeaway I would say is that there's not this clean sequence of CO and CO2 absorption strength with effective temperature. But what we do find is kind of a reproduction of this trend, which was found previously by Brittany Miles back in 2020, worked very, very hard to get spectra in this same wavelength region from the ground, and was able to kind of back out the fact that as you went down in effective temperature, you had some stronger mixing. So Brittany Miles's finding is these black points. And then Shognick came along and, using the same data set, revisited the modeling and kind of found a similar, it stood the test of more detailed modeling. So now we're coming at it with more data and more modeling, and we are finding that this trend of some weaker mixing at these temperatures and then stronger mixing at these temperatures at that COCH4 quench point is holding up. Yeah, so stronger mixing. This is this KZZ parameter that basically just means stronger mixing. What's my time? Minute and a half. Okay, cool. So this is the quick explanation of where that's coming from. You can see that this is just a set of models from the Sonora Bobcat back in 2020. Top of the atmosphere goes up, temperature goes this way. And then each of these lines is a different temperature of atmosphere. And you can see that there's this range in the middle where we have convective towards the bottom and then a radiative layer, and then it gets convective again. And so what we think is happening is that trend where you have weaker mixing is falling right at these same temperatures of like 800 to 500 Kelvin. And so if you zoom in, and so this is like a zoom in of the temperature pressure profile. This is convective, radiative, convective. And if you look at the mixing timescales, that radiative zone has orders of magnitude weaker mixing. And so if you quench in that point, you're going to have a weaker mixing strength. So that's kind of the story, and it's reinforced in our data set, which is exciting to see. I love this result because it shows us how our spectra probing that photosphere can tell us information about what's going on deeper in the atmosphere. It also shows up in the CO2 feature being off, what Sam was talking about earlier. We have these residuals in the CO2 feature, and that's because it's quenching up here in that detached convective zone. So I'm happy to leave it there if that's my time. So I will take questions. That was kind of our minimum.
Okay, we have about 3 minutes for any questions from the audience.
I'll leave it with my main second finding.
Yeah, is that DJ?
Brianna, pretty nice talk. This is CJ from UC Santa Cruz. I wonder if you find any trends between the KZZ and the surface gravity from all this sample.
Yeah, so I don't have a good figure to show you that. And I don't trust the surface gravities that we're getting from the forward model stuff. So we compared a bit between the retrievals and the forward model grids. I could have had a whole talk on my lessons learned about how to do forward model fits with these current objects. And I think that we're getting reliable temperatures, we're getting reliable C to O ratios, the radial velocity, V sine I look reasonable, but the metallicity and the surface gravity are degenerate, and the retrievals pick out one degenerate, like high surface gravity, high metallicity, and the forward models pick a low surface gravity, low metallicity. And so I think this trend with relative mixing strengths with temperature withheld me kind of marginalizing over the uncertain surface gravity. But to pull out a trend against surface gravity, I would be hesitant to do that without more work. So, yeah. I know that was my very ambitious length of this talk is, so yeah, these look like resolve. We know these are resolved binaries. This one we know is young. This one looks like it might just be low metallicity, 0535. And then 0503 looks like it's high metallicity. And then this is the one that had methane emission that they published a Nature paper about it. So it also doesn't look like a BIC needs it to be a binary. So these last two are not so clear that they need to be binaries, I would say. So, yeah.
We have Melanie Rowland, I'm moderating this next group of speakers, which is all on modeling. So if Adam pulls it up. Wait, Melanie is talking about